Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to the 7th Earth Talk at Kunsthaus Zurich. My name is Sandra Gianfreda, and I'm one of the curators here at this museum. My colleague, Catherine Hoog, and I have conceived this series of events in the run-up to our upcoming exhibition, Earth Beats the Changing Face of Nature. We have not only organized panels with experts from different fields, but we have also hosted events with experimental sounds, with cooking, and with literature. The last Earth Talk is going to take place next Thursday. You can find all information on our website, as well as in this flyer. The event tonight is being live streamed on our various channels, and it will also stay online on our website for a short period of time. People following us live on our YouTube channel can put comments and questions into the chat. We will take them up together with the questions of our public on site at the end of this talk. Our warmest thanks go as usual to our team, Rhiannon Ash, Esther Brown, Philip Bloom, Claude Grunitzky, as well as to Andre Weidmann. We would also like to thank our sponsors, the D&K Dubach Keller Foundation, the Dr. Georg and Josi Guggenheim Foundation. And now Catherine will tell us more about whom and what we can expect to hear tonight.
Thank you very much, Sandra. As you can imagine, in the context of the topic of nature and climate change, there are many different areas that could be thematized. And as you have heard, it's the 7th of 8 events. And we are sure and afraid that we cannot cover all the topics, but one was and is particularly important to us. Well, all are important, but for tonight, we wanted to know more and learn more about the causal relationship between climate change and migration and poverty. And then we went through many research phases, like since we planned this event for like more than a year now, and the exhibition even longer. And Sandra came and told me, look at this film about the Great Green Wall. And I was, the Great Green Wall, that sounds familiar. What is this, a project with trees? And yes, it's in the sub-Saharan area, from west to east, all through all the countries in the sub-Sahara. Forest program or forestry program that is going on now for quite some time. We will learn more about the progress of this project. And a little footnote, I was myself in Burkina Faso in 1994 and was already, of course, at that time about the desertification. It was already a topic. And main cause is about the problem of heating food with trees. But at that time, the climate change was not so much a topic. And now it's, of course, the desertification took much more ampleur. Got very much, even much serious. So the project, the Great Green Wall, is a project supported by the UN and by different private and public institutions. And Claude Grunitzky was the co-producer of this fantastic documentary we will talk about today. And yes, and also have the occasion to see. Our moderator is Barbara Bleisch. She is a familiar face to us through the public broadcast channel SRF and her wonderful moderation of Sternstunde Philosophie since 2011. So, this is 10 years now in this case, 10 years jubilee, but it's fresh as ever. And I just wanted to mention Barbara didn't want that make a long introduction, so I'm very short. But I could make a very long introduction to her biography, of course. But I just wanted to mention that she made a PhD on world poverty and individual responsibility, and that she is widely publishing also on ethical questions about child and parenthood, which I found very exciting. That published largely on this. So she is in different ethical boards, among others the University of Zurich. So thank you very much for being here, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, also a very warm welcome from my side. I'm glad that you have joined us tonight in this wonderful new building. It's the first time that I'm here, so enjoy if it's your first time as well. I'm really very glad to meet you, Claude Grunitzky. He's one of the most fascinating and enthusiastic persons with regard to sustainable development and transculturalism. We will hear later on what this is all about. So please welcome Claude Grunitzky.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Catherine and Sandra.
So I'd like to introduce this wonderful person to you, and it's not so easy to do that because it's not so easy to know what he actually does and is. And maybe this is why he is so successful. Claude Grunitzky is maybe best described as some sort of social innovator, I think. He's, among many other things, the founder of Trace. It's a transcultural magazine and today a media platform reaching an audience of more than 200 million people across 160 countries all around the world. The platform was successfully sold in 2010. In 2015, Claude Grunitzky launched True Africa, a media tech platform championing young African voices all over the world. The aim is empowering and making visible African insights and knowledge instead of relying on Western perceptions of Africa, as we all do, thoughtfully do. And this year, True Africa has been expanded by True Africa University, which is basically a webinar series, and I think we will discuss this project later on. Among countless other projects, Grunitzky was also the co-producer, as already mentioned, alongside Fernando Meirelles and the United Nations of the documentary The Great Green Wall, which will be screened tonight after this discussion. So I'm really glad to have you here, Claude.
Thank you, Barbara. It's such a pleasure.
Yeah, so let's start with this project, The Great Green Wall. Please just tell us more about it. What is the core idea?
The core idea is something that was imagined almost as a dream in 2007, although many other politicians and thinkers and activists had thought of this before. In 2007 was formalized this goal of building the largest living structure on Earth. And it's really a 8,000-kilometer wall of trees going across Africa from west to east, starting in Senegal and going all the way to Djibouti. And initially, there were 11 countries along the Sahel who signed up for this project, which was going to be a momentous project endorsed by the United Nations, but really run at the African Union level. The problem with it, though, is that most people have never heard of this project. And I have to admit that I had never heard of the project when I got the call about the film. And so for me, the journey with the Great Green Wall started about 5 years ago when my friend Fernando Meirelles called me and said, would you like to make a film with me as my fellow executive producer? I said, wow, that's a dream come true, because Fernando had been one of my favorite directors. In addition to being a friend, he had made a film that had a huge impact on me. It's called City of God. And I saw it when it first came out about 20 years ago. And I knew that he was very involved with environmental issues in Brazil, where he's from. And I was thinking, why is this Brazilian person calling me about a film for Africa? And so we embarked on this journey. and I will tell you more about how we actually created the film as a way to raise awareness around the Great Green Wall as a project.
And it's important to understand that, as you said, I mean, it's this long belt of trees, but the project is more than just about trees. And we've heard already that we've got this really dramatic problems of desertification due to climate change. But it's also that millions of people depend on the land and they cannot really work the land anymore because of desertification. So it's more about improving the lives of these people.
That's exactly it. When I first heard about the project and started researching it intensively, I said it's not exciting just to make a film about people planting trees. I mean, that's not going to be the most exciting film. And I realized that the issue had to be looked at from the cause and not just the consequence. The cause is desertification, as you said, Barbara. The land that used to be fertile across the Sahel is no longer fertile, and as a result, people are starving all over those countries. And when you're starving, what is your choice? Either you find a way to move out of that area, or you try to do something about it. And the Great Green Wall was conceived as a project to empower people so that they could stay in the Sahel and build communities and live as farmers in those communities, because a lot of young people were just tempted to migrate, sometimes illegally, to Europe and to other more advanced societies, quote unquote. And you'll see in the film that that is a central issue of it, because the desertification leads to starvation, leads to desperation, and a lot of people make a lot of bad choices. And if you consider that 70% of the jobs in Africa are still land jobs, agriculture jobs, we felt that we should really tell stories, positive stories about what could happen when people actually were in fertile lands and were able to make a living as opposed to thinking of migrating.
It's very impressive that there is a singer and an activist. It's Ina Moja from Mali. She's somehow the host of the documentary. She goes to the people traveling around and talking to them. And she says in the documentary, quite impressingly to me, the African dream was away from the land. By restoring the land, people are able to make a living again. So it's in a way about reframing the African dream.
It is, because like in a lot of other continents, there's been this massive urbanization, and a lot of people moved from the rural areas to the big cities, and now you have major metropolises coming up, you know, and popping up all over the continent, and people really look down on farmers. And I always considered that to be wrong. Even though I was born in Lomé in Togo, in a capital city, I always, because my father was very much into sustainable development before there was such a word, I realized that the future of Africa was going to be around transforming the way that farmers work and see their future, because their life is really horrible. You know, they're working with these very ancient techniques and nobody respects them. And on top of that, a lot of Africans end up importing most of the foods that they eat. So the whole thing was wrong, and it's an example of terrible choices that were made for the type of development that Africans saw. And on top of that, you have this population growth. We filmed in 5 countries, including in Niger, and I'll give you maybe a guess of what is the average number of children that a woman has in Niger. Or maybe somebody from the audience can give us a guess. It's actually 7.2 is the average for each woman. So the population of Niger, of the entire Sahel, is going to double in 20 years. And these are very young populations, obviously. When a woman has 7 children and she can't feed them,
May I just quickly ask you, why is that? Aren't there any contraceptions, or is it just some sort of making a living with the children?
It is lack of education around contraception. I mean, in my own case, my mom, who didn't come from a very educated family and was not very educated herself. She never finished primary school. She told me that when she was growing up, and this was a long time ago, they had never heard of contraception, right? And I'm thinking that half a century later, you still have many African women who just have not heard of contraception, and in some cases, for religious reasons, choose not to go for contraception. And then the third reason from a lot of women that I've spoken with is they look at children as an insurance policy almost. So if you have 7 children and one of them becomes successful, then they can take care of you because you don't actually have any retirement, right? And this is a situation we see all over Africa with remittances and so on. And so it's a problem because these countries are very poor and this land is very dry. It is the fastest rising temperatures in the whole world. And they have all these children to take care of. So this project, the Great Green Wall, is really a way to find a virtuous circle around a series of problems linked to education, linked to desertification, and everything else that could create perhaps a new model of development, not just for Sahel, but also for Africa. And that's why we decided to make it accessible to Africans, because I'm a highly educated African and I had never heard about it. And before embarking on the project, I spoke to about 15 different Africans that I knew, and none of them had heard about it. And I felt that the way to make it accessible and not just a film from a white person's perspective looking into Africa, as you said earlier, Barbara, was to find a native daughter of Africa. And that's why I chose Ina Moja, the singer and activist, to be the protagonist of the film. She's in every scene in the film because I felt that it was important for young Africans to relate to her. So she's a singer, she's an activist, she's very involved in issues related to female mutilation and genital mutilation. And so I felt that the credibility that she would have as somebody who was born and raised in Mali, but then is on this career path that has become global, could make it relevant, not just to African populations, but also to people outside of Africa.
That was also very impressive to me, this person in Moja. And I asked myself whether it's probably also the core idea in a way that you think that sustainable development, science, and arts have to go together. So you are also very famous for being a person bringing together different disciplines. So was it key also for the success of the film and the whole project to have this artist in the center?
It was key because one thing that unites Africans is obviously music, right? And not just Africans, but usually the world. But in this particular case, I did want it to be an intellectual film about, planting trees and sustainable development. I thought that would be really boring because, again, when I started talking about sustainable development, everybody says, oh, that's a white person's term that they always use. And I said, well, no, we have to look at the fact that Africa is on the wrong path right now. The poverty that we're seeing, the desperation that we're seeing is because bad choices were made. And I felt that having artists and having music be a core component of the film and the soundtrack relating to African dreams and African ideals, as opposed to this Afro-pessimism, which is everything you read about Africa is so negative. I felt that it was really important to drive it through music and art and culture while trying to explore solutions around major development issues.
There is one scene in the film which was really heartbreaking to me and made me really very sad. They're going to Nigeria and then they talk to children, and there is a child soldier just telling about his story, and a girl also telling us about the violence inflicted on them by Boko Haram. So my question is, can a project as the Great Green Wall really change these forms of political tensions, or what do you think about it?
I think that film, music, art, culture can actually sometimes be more powerful than just government policy if you don't explain it to people in the right way. Because sometimes politicians write laws and legislators push for laws that the population cannot understand. And I think it's very important, given that many Africans cannot read or write, I think it's very important to make things accessible to them and relatable to them, as opposed to constantly feeling like we have to be waiting for handouts from the government or from development partners or from the UN or from European nations. I think it's really important to start with their own culture and see why these things are affecting them. And in this particular case, there's an educational component in it. And we wanted to explain why Boko Haram and terrorism is such a threat in that part of the world. Many people read about what's happening in Mali and what's happening with Boko Haram and how they kidnap all these women in Chibok, which was a big story when Michelle Obama started talking about it. But they don't understand why there came to be so much terrorism in those countries. And the reason is the media never talks about it. I mean, I created True Africa, as I said, because I wanted to bring an African perspective to African issues. One of the reasons that Boko Haram is such a force still in the area, and not just Boko Haram, affiliates of ISIS and Al-Qaeda throughout the Sahel region, is because of climate change. And you will, I don't want to reveal too much because that's a central element of the beginning of the film that you will see, but the consequences of climate change lead to terrorism, which now affect populations like Nigeria's that you mentioned. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that Nigeria, I mean, there's more children born in Nigeria every year than in the entire European Union. Of course, I know Switzerland is not in the entire European Union, but if you include every EU country, and you even actually include the UK, even though they're out, you would have more children born in Nigeria than in all these countries. So this population issue is major. And so these girls who are not able to get an education because of terrorism, they're afraid of going to school, there have to be real solutions where you look at the root cause as opposed to just quote unquote security forces trying to capture members of Boko Haram and all these terrorist groups. Because you can capture, as we know now, you can capture dozens and dozens of terrorists, but there's going to be new and new terrorists coming up. And so these security issues are on top of all the other socioeconomic issues that I mentioned before. So it's a very complex situation. And what we try to do with the film is tell it in a very simple way without over-intellectualizing it.
The documentary was supported by the United Nations, and we all know that the United Nations are as strong as the support of all the countries around the world is. So what do you expect from the other countries, especially from Europe?
Well, one of the key challenges, I have to say, when I was raising money for the film, and there were a couple of us raising money for the film, is that we were very lucky because the United Nations is, as you said earlier, Catherine, funding and supporting this project. So we were able to get seed funding from the United Nations, and then we got funding from the World Bank. But it was and the country of Ireland also funded, the Development Agency of Ireland funded the film, but it was extremely difficult to secure funding from the film. And so we had to go hand in hand to private donors to be able to make this film and to shoot in 5 different countries, which is what we did. And what was interesting about that process is that after the film came out and won all these awards in festivals all over the world, there was a new momentum on the political side. And earlier this year, at the One Planet Summit, President Emmanuel Macron said that he had reached a deal led by France and the French Development Agency and the UN, the World Bank, to secure 14 billion euros in funding for the Great Green Wall. And that was really major because we needed somebody like that to have the political will to take this to the next level, because the problem is that only 15% of the wall has been completed so far. And if you're going to be planting all these trees over 8,000 kilometers, it needs funding, not just for planting trees, because that's the least expensive part of it, but it's also most for the education of the populations on how do you revitalize this land? How do you have pathways for more sustainable farming? You know, how do you start exporting what is coming out of these lands? And so it's such a huge project that we needed high-level politicians to endorse it. And then the other part of it was we needed Africans to embrace it as well. So part of the work that we've been doing since the film came out is organizing events all over Africa with a lot of activists that are now part of the Great Green Wall Frontline movement, we're calling it, who are going on roadshows to educate local populations on the choices they have. And that not every young person should be thinking of coming to Europe as their only solution, that they can get involved in, again, a new sustainable model that is very much driven by the fertility of the land. And it's worked really well in some countries, like in Nigeria, like in Senegal, like in Ethiopia. But in other countries, we are having a real issue because the populations don't understand what we're trying to do.
Reshaping and reframing narratives or visions or dreams is in a way, I think, the core passion you have. Am I right?
It is. But I want to make it even more specific, Barbara. I'm glad you asked me that question, which is a really intelligent question, I have to say. You know, growing up as a Black man who was born in Togo, raised in Togo, but then moving to Paris and London and now New York, I've always had to carry with me a lot of stereotypes and perceptions of what a Black man is. And if you add the layer of Africa, which is associated with all these ills and all these, again, stereotypes of poverty and lack of achievement, lack of ambition, one of the things that I've done throughout my entire career as a media entrepreneur and as a film producer and as an educator is try to get Africans and Black people to believe in themselves, as opposed to always having this inferiority complex, which is manifested in thinking that everything that comes from outside of Africa or Black culture is better. You know, we have a lot of issues that we deal with in Africa, which is still very much linked to the post-colonial brainwashing. And, you know, if you look at just the way we don't even value our own foods and we import rice from Thailand or from other parts of the world, we don't value our own culture, our own films, because we'd rather watch, you know, films that are coming from Brazil as telenovelas or Hollywood and so on. I'm hoping that this new generation will have more faith in the power of the African dream. And the spoiler is that the very first scene that you will see in the film is the story, because it's the dream. In this particular case that you will see, it was a stunted dream, but all I can say is it was one of our freedom fighters or real African heroes who unfortunately was killed, and he had a dream, and I think the whole movement was inspired by this one person's dream. And what I try to do in my work is to be a conduit to new types of dreams to emerge, as opposed to Africans and Black people in general not believing that they can achieve things that white people can achieve or Asian people can achieve, and always being influenced by other models of development.
And your project of the university is the newest project. So is this university you're building up right now also part of this reshaping, rethinking the African dream?
Barbara, absolutely. And I'll say that this True Africa University that I'm building in partnership with MIT is the project of a lifetime, because it is assembling all the thought process and all the experiences, all the learnings and all the failures that I've had in my various ventures, whether it's in media, in education, and I'm hoping that all those learnings from those successes and the failures will help to educate millions of young Africans online. So earlier you said we started with a webinar series, but that was just to start in March. We have now since produced online courses for students from 20 African countries, and we're launching a Master's in Sustainable Development program in partnership with my partner, Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, and we are going to be educating millions of Africans through the internet. Because again, the problem with population growth, as I said earlier, is when you have such huge explosive growth, the governments just don't have enough money to build enough schools, enough universities to educate all those millions of young Africans. Again, the median age in Africa is 20 years old, and 60% of the population is under the age of 25. If we don't help to educate them, then what's going to happen? It's going to be more terrorism. And so the internet is the only solution that I saw, and that's why we're so hopeful. And I'm calling it the project of a lifetime, because it is by far the most important project I've ever led.
And do these young people, these young students, have laptops or anything like that?
Well, this is what was interesting when we finished our first course, which was last month. They find ways to connect through their mobile phone, and we pay for the data access so that they don't get cut off, because it happens on Zoom, the courses, and sometimes, most of the times they wouldn't put on the video, and that's because the data is so expensive. And so what we found is that they always find solutions because they're so hungry to learn. And that really gave me so much hope in the future of the continent, because in this sea of desperation, of misery, of poverty, there is a new generation that will not accept the bad choices that were made by their leaders from previous generations, and they want to take matters into their own hands. And because our entire curriculum is focused on sustainable development, whether it's sustainable agriculture, water, renewable energy, and the new development models that we're pushing for Africa, we hope that these students will become evangelists, the new leaders of Africa, actually. Even if they're not politically involved, they will start organizations locally, which will end up having impacts on their local communities, and that will be real success if we can get there.
Listening to you makes me feel like I have like some sort of ambassador for African perspectives in front of me, a very successful ambassador. And I think the core idea is also not to rely on Western ideas about Africa. And in philosophy, I think key is the work done by Achille Mbembe and Felwine Sarr. Felwine Sarr wrote this wonderful book, Afrotopia, which was also translated into German, I think 2 years ago, which was very well received also in Switzerland. And I know that Felwine Sarr is also important to you. One of his core ideas is that he says that decolonization has not really happened yet. There is always so much colonization still in the thinking, especially in the thinking of perhaps white people, but also in the thinking of Black people, of African people. What can we do about it? I mean, where do we have to start from?
I started 25 years ago in media, and I've spent my entire career trying to push positive narratives about Africa, because I was just tired of what I was seeing on BBC, on CNN, and Le Monde. It was just horrible, because these people these journalists, I would see them sometimes, they would just go to Dakar for 3 days and they would write a report. They'd never come back. They never stay in touch with the people they interviewed. And that would be the dominant view and the dominant opinion because it was a famous white journalist who went to Africa. And when you mention people like Felwine Sarr and Achille Mbembe, who are two of the leading thinkers that came out of the African continent, we consider ourselves to be in the league of people who need to push this kind of decolonization movement, because it's really mental models. It's the mindsets of Africans who, again, believe that everything that comes from the Western world is better. You know, what I was saying earlier about the apathy about that many young Africans, you know, have in comparison to the ones that are really ambitious that we're aligning ourselves with. All they've seen is leaders expecting handouts from white people, essentially, right? So they know that these economies are not sustainable, and they're expecting Switzerland to give money, they're expecting France to give money, and this is what's been happening. And it's not a bad thing. I said I was very happy that President Macron led this $14 billion funding drive for the Great Green Wall. But what people like Achille Mbembe and Felwine Sarr and myself are saying is, it's time for these initiatives to come out of Africa, as opposed to always expecting the solution to come from elsewhere and to be implemented in Africa. And you know, when you look at the projects that people like Felwine Sarr are involved in now, it's, you know, we talked about it briefly before, Barbara, the restitution movement, which is about taking some of this art that we see in Western museums like this one and taking that art back to the African continent, is a very important project. Because now you're talking about our identity. Now you're talking about our roots. Now you're talking about our ancestors. And why should the work of our ancestors be at the British Museum or in museums in Europe? Why? It doesn't make any sense. And so the fact that President Macron was able to empower people like Felwine Sarr to find a solution so that these artworks can be brought back to the African continent, it feels very symbolic to a lot of people, but to people like us who believe in transculturalism, who believe in Afrotopia, who believe in Afro-optimism, it's important because it will help to decolonize the mindsets of Africans who don't think that they deserve any better.
One idea of Felwine Sarr is also that Western thinking is very strong in individualism, whereas African thinking is strong in like communities, in connectivity. And I think that when it comes to climate change, but also when it comes to the corona pandemia, we have seen how much interconnected we are. We are not like islands. We all belong together. And without solidarity, we are just nothing. So I sometimes think that perhaps we can also say that some ideas of African thinking will perhaps be key to solve all the problems with regard to climate change.
Yes, what Felwine's written a lot about the individual mindset, which is very much rooted in Western thinking, and the community aspect of African living, right? So I was not raised just by my mom, but I was also raised by my stepmom and my aunts, and this is just how it is for Africa in general. And there's even some societies that are matrilinear societies where the women make the decisions. People don't talk about that enough. But the real problem, though, and I'm glad you mentioned the coronavirus and what's happening now, which is really showing the weakness of the model that is the modus operandi that we've all been living in. Look at this COVAX, what a disaster it's been. This virus that was destined to developing nations. Now, it's only 1.5% of Africans who've received the vaccine. And I live in New York, and when I left 2 days ago, 2 of my friends were getting their 3rd shot. And it just infuriates me that there could be so little solidarity And you have to look at the root cause. Why, once again, do Africans have to put themselves in a situation where they have to be reliant on American vaccines or European vaccines in order to solve a major public health issue like we're seeing now, right? And so I was hoping that there would be, in the future, African labs that would create an African vaccine for the African population as opposed to, again, looking for handouts. So I'm putting myself in Americans' shoes. You know, they have to take care of themselves, right? I was thinking the individual is at the heart of American thinking, right? It's all about individual property, individual welfare, and the individual pursuit of liberty. Now, I was wrestling with that. And because there was somebody who said that it's from the World Health Organization who said that it was unacceptable what was happening because it's almost like Americans are giving a brand new life vest to people in the sea when everybody else is drowning around them. Whereas their own life vest is just a little bit torn and a little bit worn, but everybody else is drowning, but the Americans want a brand new life vest in the sea. And I think that's a really good analogy. But the reality is, let's look at why we are once again in this position where we have to rely on others for the vaccine. You know, and that's why I'm so focused on education now and research and African thinking, because in the future, maybe Africa can develop in the way that India has developed, right? And I don't want to get too political here, but I think that these are major issues that are life and death issues. And again, the result is very bad choices that were made by really corrupt African leaders.
You sound in a way very diplomatic, which is perhaps not really a wonder because you're the son of a diplomat or someone who has been appointed ambassador in Washington after having left Togo when you were 8 years old. But apart from being diplomatic, are you sometimes just angry?
I'm often really angry because as a media entrepreneur, as a journalist, as an entrepreneur, as an educator, I see a lot of things and I meet a lot of people, and I often try to get to the truth of the matter. And I'm really angry because a lot of people don't realize how urgent the need for action is. And I guess people can just go about their lives and we would have situations where rich people would get even much richer, rich nations would get even much richer, and Africa would just collapse, right? And this dominant media narrative, which was around the collapse of Africa, was something that was countered by another narrative, which everybody started calling Africa Rising. But I'm not of those people who are into cheerleading. Oh, Africa Rising, everything's gonna be great. It's a great media story to now be talking about Africa Rising, because yes, there's innovation in Africa and there's been progress made in specific areas, but the reality is the gap just keeps getting wider and wider. And as somebody who has access to the best academic institutions, the best cultural institutions, billionaires, and major politicians, I want to use that access to help to bring some of that real knowledge to the people that I see on the ground, because misinformation is this reality now. They just see these things on WhatsApp, they don't have any context, and these things get shared on WhatsApp, and they believe that that is the reality. I'm not even gonna go about all the things they say about Bill Gates and the vaccine, and they think that Bill Gates is trying to basically kill off the African population. That's obviously extreme theory, but there's a lot of uneducated people, not just in Africa, but also in Brazil and obviously in America and Europe, who believe those things. But the problem in Africa is that there's so little education to start with that it's very easy to convince a large part of the population of these mistruths. And I'm trying to align myself with real change makers and real idealists so that we can find real long-term solutions. And this thing will outlive me, but I'm hoping that the students that we train will continue and carry the torch so that 50 years from now, we're not talking about the same things that we were talking when I was born.
You're not only a transcultural thinker, you are also a transcultural person in a way. As you said, you were born in Togo, you were educated in Paris, in London, now are married and living in New York. I think you carry 3 passports. You speak like 7 languages, 6 languages, which is really impressive. What was decisive for your own thinking? I mean, what would you say, perhaps, like, what did you read when you were young, or which philosophies do you like?
Well, a philosopher that I personally really like is, there's a lot, but one that I really like because I've gotten to know him very well and he's influenced my thinking in a deep way is the one that I told you about earlier, is Souleymane Bachir Diagne. Souleymane Bachir Diagne is a Senegalese philosopher who was educated in Paris, and he is, and this is the first time it's happened, he is the head of the African Studies Department and also the French Studies Department at Columbia University in New York. And he's a real deep thinker, transcultural thinker, because he has the same experience, West Africa, going to Paris, and then ending up in New York. And he can be, like me, very objective on some of these key issues of our time. And he writes a lot about the issues that we talked about, identity and the roots of conflict and solidarity and what I call active solidarity, which is really the key thing for me. But he's also a real deep thinker on Islam. And he's written some of the most important books on Islam. And, you know, growing up in Paris and going back to Paris and being married to a French woman, I realized that the one common thread in French society now is Islamophobia. My friends from North Africa get mistreated all the time. My students, they can't get jobs because their name was Mohammed. You know, and this deep hatred of Muslims in France and obviously in many other countries in Europe is something that I just couldn't understand. Of course, you know, the shallow answers, the rise of radical Islam and everything else, but it's much deeper than that. And Souleymane Bachir Diagne really helped me to understand why there's so much conflict between these kind of Christian heritage societies and Islam, which many people consider hasn't entered modernity. And so I think we need people like that who have this transcultural perspective because we're more objective. You know, I'm a French citizen, so I can speak as a Frenchman. I'm an American citizen, so I can speak as an American. I'm a Togolese citizen, so I can speak as an African. And so I'm not gonna be biased towards one perspective because there's good in each culture, but I think that sometimes the political problems that we're seeing pretty much everywhere, right, with the rise of national populism is because too many people rely on just one kind of national thinking, and we try to approach it from the perspective of objectivity. And when you have to navigate multiple worlds and you have to navigate multiple languages on a daily basis, it forces you to be objective as opposed to thinking that your identity is only one thing.
That's really interesting because, I mean, we all know we live in a globalized world, and maybe transculturalism is like some sort of intellectual answer to globalization. It's just key if it comes to understand what globalization is about and what the problems we have with globalization and also with climate change. And we need to focus on some sort of transcultural ideas.
Well, we, you know, and I published 2 books on this subject, we thought that when Barack Obama was elected in November 2008, that would be the beginning of the real rise of transcultural thinking. Because Obama, by becoming the most powerful man in the world, as an African who's also American, who grew up in Hawaii and Indonesia and had this kind of global worldview, was very interested in European philosophers and had this amazing global worldview, which he expressed in very optimistic terms, you know, even his leadership on the climate change issue, we thought that the problem had been solved when Obama was elected. little did we know that our hopes would be dashed because there were so many people, not just in America, but starting with America, who resented that transcultural point of view as embodied by a Black man like Obama. And so the work that we're doing now is to help to educate people, knowing that there's going to be a huge part of the population that is very rooted in nationalism, that hates globalization, and that believes that it should be country first. And because I reject all that, I have to find new methods. And I think media is very important, but I quickly found out that education is actually more important than media.
I've read, and I don't know whether it's true, that you also, when you were young, read a lot of Albert Camus, the Algerian and French philosopher. And many people think that Albert Camus is mainly the philosopher of the absurd, working on the absurdity of life and the sense of life and so on. But to me, I think Albert Camus is also the thinker of nature and of love of nature. The writings, the late writings of Albert Camus are mainly about the light in Algeria, the plants, nature and love of nature. So my question is this also something you love about Albert Camus? And is perhaps love of nature also, I don't know, perhaps part of the dream you have when it comes to the Great Green Wall or to climate change and fighting climate change?
Yes, Barbara, that's another really very interesting perspective. And I'm glad you picked up on Camus because obviously I discovered him through the book L'étranger, the Stranger. And of course, I felt that that book was about me because I was growing up in Paris and people would always ask me, where are you really from? Right? And so I was always a stranger in France, even though I became a citizen. And, you know, Camus, obviously that book is a masterpiece. It shaped a lot of us. But what you said about nature is also very important because I was born in Lomé and I only lived in major capital cities, right? So Lomé, Washington, D.C., Paris, London, and New York is not a capital city, but it acts like one. And I always really longed for nature because I was always in urban settings. And I was saying, like, as a child, my father used to try to get us to engage with nature, but he had his own political ambitions, and that meant having to be in the city a lot. So I rediscovered that a lot as I try to get, you know, closer to nature when I got older. But in Camus, there's a third dimension. In addition to his work on identity and his work on nature, there's a third dimension that a lot of people don't know, which I absolutely adore, is his writing on love. You know, Camus had a mistress that he was deeply in love with, and the love letters that he was writing to her and their exchange of correspondence is some of the most beautiful writing I've ever seen in the French language. And so if you combine freedom and liberation through rediscovering your identity in a world where you're made to feel alien, where you're always made to feel like the other, which was my experience, and you link that to nature and love somehow, then all of a sudden you have a trifecta for happiness. And I think that that is what I've been seeking, but it took me a lifetime to get to this understanding of what was really missing in my life and how my work can inform a new vision of happiness.
It's so interesting to talk to you, but I would also like to give you the opportunity to ask questions. If you have any, I think we need a little bit more light because I cannot see people raising their hands. Please feel free to ask your questions. You can also raise them in German or in some sort of English, like my English. It's no problem. Feel free. And perhaps you also have questions in the chat. I don't know. Yes, please. There is a question here. So, please. We just need to wait for the microphone.
Yes, sorry. And for those who want to ask questions, please say your name briefly and a short question, please.
Hi, Juan Manuel. I come from Argentina. First of all, a little comment, because you were talking about transcultural way of thinking, and I come from South America, and all the time you mentioned the United States, you were referring as America, and America has many countries. And one thing, sorry, I'm a bit nervous. There is in America also a philosopher called Enrique Dussel, who works a lot about the transcultural things and a transcultural way of thinking, and also what he calls the transmodernity. And he points a lot about the identity of every country, every culture, and the way that each community, culture can talk from their own point of view. And what I haven't watched the film yet, and maybe that clarifies it more. But the point is like, yeah, that I'm going there. How are the possibilities, for example, in Africa, to give a person a camera and guide them to they tell their own narratives? So, because one thing is me coming from Argentina, you from Togo, but living in Europe and coming back to Africa or to South America, and we do the film. But how is for that people doing the film that never could leave their countries? Like, as a way of educating and say, okay, this is our narratives, this is our cultures, these are the tales that build our sense of community.
Okay. So thank you for the question and for picking up on the fact that I said America a lot when I meant the United States, and America is a constellation of countries that are very different. And I've spent a lot of time in Latin America. I have a house in Brazil. I've been going there for a while. And as I said to you, my fellow executive producer, Fernando Meirelles, is Brazilian. I know Brazilians in Argentina, you know, in football is not always the thing, but I understand the diversity of perspectives. And there's a lot of commonalities between what I see in Brazil and what I see in many of the African countries in which I work. The issue that I mentioned earlier around misinformation is very real. There's misinformation and there's disinformation. And what I found over the last 3 years, as I said earlier, is that a lot of it gets transmitted through WhatsApp and short videos. And people just send these videos, and these videos go viral, and there might be a clip from YouTube that gets cut into something that could be sent through WhatsApp so it doesn't take up too much data for people who don't have too much money to be spending so much money on data for the internet. And that, as I said, is a real source of frustration for me as a media entrepreneur and as a journalist, because I see all these lies. And so one of the things that we did as part of this next phase that we're calling Great Green Wall Frontline is we created an Instagram page, which you can see, where we're encouraging young Africans to make videos with their camera. And we are sharing those videos on Instagram, and we're hoping to have ultimately tens of thousands of people sharing their vision, because they are witnesses to what's happening in their communities, and they no longer need to be mediated by journalists like myself or people coming from elsewhere. And we believe that the power of social media can be utilized for those purposes versus just the misinformation and disinformation that everybody talks about Facebook and so on. And so given that the quality of the videos that can be made with the phone now is actually really good, we think that some of these very short clips that we see on Instagram and can then be repurposed for Facebook, obviously, and WhatsApp, the most promising talent that we identify through these mediums, we will be in a position to help them to make actual short films with real funding and real cameras. So that is the cultural element of the Great Green Wall, which is going to be a huge part of our dissemination strategy going forward.
Thank you very much for sharing your insightful thoughts. I have a question regarding what you recommend to us, and especially young people in the global north, who are really aiming to build these bridges between the intercultural bridges, as well as decolonizing their own minds. We also have to do this work. And at the same time, as a third perspective, who really struggle to navigate in the difficult area of climate change. So what is your suggestions or your advice to people in the global north to navigate these three different really challenging issues?
Well, thank you. I think these are actually two questions, which I will answer in sequence. The first question is related to people who want to get involved. And getting involved means that you do more than research on the internet. It means that you actually have to go to these countries and to these communities. And I see more and more young people from the global north who are going to these countries and getting involved with various projects. And that is really very inspiring to me. However, and there's a big however, a lot of these young people go for a few months, maybe 3-month project. Some end up spending maybe a whole year, and they come back to the global north, and they don't actually stay in touch with the people whose lives they might have touched. And I've spoken to many Africans on the ground who feel like they're being used as guinea pigs for young white people's research projects. And I look back on my career as a media entrepreneur, and I think about some of the students I've also had as an educator. So I've been teaching at Harvard University, and I have some of the most brilliant students. And sometimes I'm very tough with them because they applied to Harvard and they were able to put in their application that they went to Burkina Faso or Togo or Mali, and they volunteered for a year. And then it looked great on the application for Harvard University, right? So now they get into the Kennedy School and they can go and work at the World Bank afterwards, and they can have a great job. Some of them, they can work for McKinsey and Company. And I always ask them, so how often do you stay in touch with those people whose lives you described in your application? And most of the time, they don't stay in touch very much at all. And that, to me, is heartbreaking because you create real bonds with people and you break those bonds because, once again, you're thinking about your individual welfare. And they're like, well, you know, I have to focus on school and have to focus on getting a job and getting married. I understand all that. We all have to think about those things. But to me, building long-term relationships is key. And the second question, please remind me because I had it in my head and I forgot.
Probably the decolonization, the work we have to do on the global north, as well as the climate change.
Oh, yes.
Especially Africa is most affected, while we not yet imagine how to navigate that, and what would you advise?
Yes, on climate change and decolonization, it's such a huge issue. I mean, I think there's very little doubt around the fact that climate change is the biggest threat we face globally. And because it's such a huge, intractable issue, my advice is to just pick one specific element of climate change that might be linked to your own interest and to get involved with that specific part of it. And you can leave the bigger, mega, macro projects to the governments and to these big development agencies that may or may not be affiliated with the United Nations. So in our case, we picked just one project, which is the Great Green Wall. And we're running with that. And that's my focus. And I meet some of my other students, they're focused on finding solutions around solar energy, even as entrepreneurs. And that's great too. So my advice is really picking one and actually making sure, if you're coming from the global north and working in the south, making sure that the solution that gets implemented locally in these communities has the buy-in of the local communities, as opposed to approaching it with a superiority complex, thinking that the know-how, the knowledge, and the expertise that is coming from the global north is superior to the intuitive knowledge that the people on the ground actually have.
I think this is a very important topic. I mean, I think you want also to remind us that it's all about deep, rich involvement, about the sincere involvement. And you're considered to be some sort of network genius. Every magazine writing articles about you say, he's a real network genius. And what you say now, it's not only about networking like interchanging cards, but it's really about long-term relationships. It's about even maybe loving relationships and relationships that are really, really go deep into a topic.
I think that it's so key, and I sometimes just get so upset when this networking thing gets so tied to my name, because there was a very famous Harvard Business School case study written about me that I'm the most connected person in the world. That really is frustrating, because it gets taught in business schools all over the world now, and I have students reaching out to me every week on LinkedIn trying to network. And I always say to them, I'm not looking to network. I'm only interested in building long-term relationships. Especially now when people can reach you on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. I just can't keep up. You know, I'm into getting to know you over a period of time where we can actually maybe even work on something together. I'll give you the example once again of this film. Fernando Mireles, I met him, we had mutual friends, but I met him in Marrakesh because I organized a concert for the closing of a UN climate change convention, one of the COPs. And we had this love for Brazil in common. I knew who he was, and I'd been following him. We became friends. But he's the one who reached out to me a few years later saying, let's make this film together. You know, because I stayed in touch and we built a relationship. It wasn't just, here's my business card, you know, let's move on, or me name dropping that I'm friends with Fernando Mireles. It's about what is our common vision and what mutual understanding can we come to around making the world a better place.
That's interesting also because sustainability is all about long-term visions, about long-term investment.
It is, but a lot of people, specifically some of my students and the young people that I meet now, which I'll just call millennials and Generation Z to simplify, they are into instant gratification. And I'm trying to talk about solutions that will be in place in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and they're only about the here and now. And this is a problem because of the acceleration of the world where everything is moving so fast. I can understand why they want everything right now, but the reality is, you know, if you're coming from an African perspective where you are living day to day, and you don't know if you're gonna get a meal for lunch, and now you're tense because the schools are closed because of COVID, and the meal that you used to get at lunch at school, now you can't even get that meal, I can understand why your only focus must be on today. But from the young people that you mentioned earlier who are living in the global north, who don't necessarily have to worry about where their meal is gonna come from because these are advanced democracies that provide for citizens, and there's a middle class, especially here in Switzerland, you know, I really encourage them to take the long view as opposed to just thinking they need everything right now. And I even give them advice. You know, it goes to dating. You know, they expect everything to happen immediately. And no, you have to wait. And the beauty is in getting to know the person and working towards it. But now, obviously, with the apps and dating apps and all that, they want everything is encouraging instant gratification. That's the problem with the society we're living in general.
It's like growing trees, needs time. So if there aren't any questions left, I think we also run out of time. Let me please just ask you a last question. What is your next project? I'm sure there is one.
The next project, well, the main project is True Africa University, which I think I'll be doing, for the rest of my life, because I just see it getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But the next film project is a project called Blue Carbon, which is also about the environment. Based on the success of the Great Green Wall, we were able to get funding from a major foundation in the United States, not America, in the United States, to make a film about blue carbon, which is a very sustainable way to use the oceans to preserve the environment and to push for biodiversity. So that is the next documentary we're making with Fernando Meirelles, with the same team that made the Great Green Wall.
So we very much look forward to that.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Claude Grunitzky. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
There will be a very short break now, like 10 minutes perhaps. You can feel free to have some drinks or to go outside for 1 minute.
Okay, but yes, then everything is said. Not said, but said. Sorry. Thank you very much, Barbara, Claude, for this wonderful evening, and hope to see you soon again, one more time in this Earth Talk series. Next Thursday already will be a discussion about economic crisis and climate and Corona and 2008-9 and so on. So please go and have something to drink at the bar, as Barbara already said, or use the opportunity to go a little bit outside. And we continue exactly at 7:30. And the film will be finished at 9 p.m. Then the evening is over. Thank you very much again to both of you.
Thank you so much.